My husband called me nobody in front of 200 people at the Whitestone Museum charity auction. I was standing beside a glass display of antique wedding tiaras, holding an auction paddle in one hand, when Grant Voss slipped his arm around Celine Ward's waist and smiled like humiliating me was part of the evening's entertainment. He looked at me and said, "Marin, please don't make this awkward. You were never the reason I became successful. You were just present." Celine laughed softly, touching the sapphire necklace at her throat. I knew exactly which account had paid for it. I knew the transaction code. I knew the date. I knew my signature was attached to every major movement in the financial structure that kept Grant's world running. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I placed my auction paddle quietly on the table beside me and touched the folded bank notice inside my clutch. I had put it there before I left the house that evening, not because I knew Grant would say something cruel in public, but because I had learned, over 6 years of marriage, that preparation is more useful than prediction. By morning, his entire empire would stop moving without me. He just did not know it yet. My name is Marin Ellis. I am 33 years old, born into the Ellis family of Boston, and for 6 years I was married to Grant Voss, the founder of Voss Urban Group. To most people who attended the events we went to together, I was the quiet wife in cream silk who stood at Grant's side during fundraisers and smiled while he accepted praise from people who found him impressive. I was good at being calm in rooms that were performing loudly. I had grown up in those rooms and learned early that the people who spoke the most were rarely the ones who controlled the most. What the public did not know, what Grant himself seemed to have forgotten, was that Voss Urban Group had survived its worst year because of Ellis Legacy Trust, my family's private financial structure. And not just survived. It had continued operating because I had signed as the controlling guarantor on a secured credit agreement when Grant was too proud to admit his company was weeks away from collapse. He had needed a name he could borrow. I had given him mine. He had never fully understood what that meant. He was about to find out. Celine Ward was not the first woman Grant had been careless with. She was the first one he brought openly into my world. She was 29, polished, and ambitious in the way people become when they confuse being near power with actually having it. That night at the museum, she wore a sapphire necklace that sat perfectly against her collarbone. Grant had told the few people who asked that it was a private investment piece, a gift to himself, something he had purchased through a business account. I knew the transaction code. I knew the account number. I knew what kind of bank review would follow once I stopped protecting the activity connected to it. Celine had no idea that the necklace around her throat had been purchased using a credit facility that required my authorization for large or unusual withdrawals. She had no idea that the woman Grant had just reduced to just present was the reason any of his accounts had continued operating at all. She smiled at me that night like a woman who believed she had already won. I looked at her calmly and said nothing. I had learned that the most powerful response to someone who thinks they have beaten you is to let them believe it a little longer. The Whitestone Museum auction was not simply a charity event. It was Grant's performance. Investors were in that room. City officials were in that room. Reporters from 2 local business publications were taking notes near the back wall. Grant had arranged the evening carefully, the way he arranged everything that was meant to make him look successful, connected, and in control. He wanted the room to see him as a man at the height of his power, desirable, untouchable, and moving forward. Placing Celine beside him while reducing me to just present was not a slip of the tongue. It was a calculated statement, delivered in front of exactly the audience he wanted to witness it. What Grant had not calculated was the building itself. The donor wall behind him carried my grandmother's name in carved stone. The largest anonymous pledge made at that auction had come from me, submitted quietly through the Ellis Foundation the week before. The museum staff knew my family's name. Several of the donors in that room had worked with my father for decades. Grant thought he was rewriting the story of our marriage in public. He chose a room that my family had been part of long before he ever walked into it. 3 years before the auction, Voss Urban Group had nearly collapsed. A waterfront development deal that Grant had pushed forward too quickly fell apart when a key financing partner withdrew at the last stage. Grant came home on a Tuesday evening looking pale, tightly controlled, and desperate in the way that proud men look when they have finally run out of other options. He said he needed me to temporarily help stabilize things. He said it was a short-term gap. He said it would be handled cleanly and quickly. My father, Harlan Ellis, agreed to allow Ellis Legacy Trust to support a secured credit structure, but only under one firm condition: I would hold controlling authority over the release of funds. Every major transfer, every extension, every withdrawal above a set threshold required either my approval or a formal bank review. Grant signed the agreement that night without negotiating a single clause because he needed the rescue more urgently than he needed his pride. He shook my father's hand at the kitchen table and said he fully understood the terms. He never truly believed I would enforce them when it mattered. That single misunderstanding turned out to be the most expensive mistake he ever made. Before I signed the guarantor agreement, my father sat across from me at his study desk and handed me a silver fountain pen. He said, "Marin, love can be generous, but money must be precise." I remember thinking he was being unnecessarily cold. I thought he was placing conditions on something that should have been offered freely between family members who trusted each other. I signed the agreement and put the pen back on his desk and did not say much else that evening. It took years for me to fully understand what my father had actually done. He had not been cold at all. He had been merciful. He had seen something in Grant that I had not yet been willing to see, and rather than say it directly, he had protected me through structure instead of argument. The agreement did not restrict Grant from running his company as he chose. It simply ensured that the credit line holding it together could not be moved, drained, or redirected without my knowledge and consent. Grant called it paperwork. He treated it like a formality from a cautious father-in-law that would never matter in practice. By the morning after the museum auction, every sentence of that paperwork mattered more than anything else in his financial world. After the auction, Grant found me near the marble staircase and pulled me into a quiet corridor away from the crowd. His voice was soft and measured, the tone he used when he wanted to appear reasonable while delivering something unreasonable. He said he wanted a peaceful separation, one that would protect the company from what he called emotional disruption. Then he handed me a folded document. It was a draft separation agreement, already prepared, already printed. He had planned this conversation before he arrived at the museum that evening. The agreement offered me a small financial settlement. He kept the penthouse. Voss Urban Group remained entirely in his control. My name had already been quietly removed from several internal company documents in the weeks before, though he did not mention that. He had arranged everything neatly, the way he arranged his public image, with confidence that no one would look closely enough to find the gaps. He waited for my reaction with the patient expression of a man who expects the person across from him to feel grateful for being offered anything at all. I looked at the document for a moment. Then I folded it and placed it back in his hand. I told Grant my attorney would respond. He smiled at that. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile that says he has already decided how the next chapter ends and finds your participation mildly entertaining. He said, "Marin, don't turn this into something ugly. You don't have the stomach for war." I looked past him down the corridor toward the main hall, where Celine was standing near a cluster of guests with her champagne glass and her sapphire necklace. Then I looked back at Grant and said, "You're right. I prefer clean endings." He heard surrender. He heard a woman stepping back from a confrontation she knew she could not win. What I meant was something entirely different. I meant documentation. I meant the encrypted folder on my laptop that I had been updating quietly for 6 months. I meant the transfer records, the hotel invoices, the jewelry receipts, and the pending condo deposit I had traced to an account that required my authorization for exactly that kind of transaction. Grant left the corridor still smiling. I stood there for a moment in the quiet and took one slow breath. Then I went back into the main hall, said goodbye to 3 donors by name, and walked out to my car. Grant left the museum with Celine in the company town car, a vehicle billed to Voss Urban Group's operational account. I rode home alone, watching rain move down the window glass while my phone filled with messages from people who had witnessed what happened at the display case. I did not answer any of them. I opened my encrypted folder instead and went through the last 6 months of flagged transfers one more time. The list was not short. A sapphire necklace, 3 hotel suites across 2 cities, private car service billed as client entertainment, a cash advance pulled on a Tuesday when Grant had claimed he was at a development meeting, and most significantly, a condo deposit submitted under initials I recognized as Celine's, drawn from a guarantor-backed account that could not legally be used that way without my formal approval. Grant had not just built a life beside someone else. He had used my name and my family's trust to finance it. The necklace Celine wore to the auction had been purchased with credit my signature had made available. The car that carried them both home had been built to the same structure. I sat with that for the full length of the drive home. Then I called Nora Bellamy. Nora Bellamy had been my attorney for 4 years. She was 51, precise, and entirely unmoved by drama in the way that people become when they have spent decades working in rooms where drama is used as a substitute for evidence. She had handled my family's legal matters through 2 estate transitions and 1 complicated trust restructuring. When I called her that night at 11:42, she answered on the second ring. I told her everything in order. The auction, the public comment, the corridor, the draft agreement, the transfer records, the condo deposit. Nora listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she asked one question. She said, "Did he publicly place Celine in a position of partnership while simultaneously using guarantor-backed accounts for her personal benefit?" I said yes. She exhaled slowly, the way she does when something has become legally clear. Then she said, "Tomorrow morning, we will notify the bank." Not emotionally, formally. She told me to get some sleep. I told her I would. I did not sleep much, but I lay in the dark with the quiet certainty of someone who has stopped waiting for a situation to improve and has finally decided to simply end it correctly. Grant called an emergency board meeting 3 days after the bank freeze. He told his investors it was a temporary domestic complication that would be resolved within the week. He presented it as a misunderstanding between himself and an overly cautious family trust structure, nothing material, nothing that reflected the actual health of the company. He expected to manage the room the way he always managed rooms, with confidence, fluency, and the practiced authority of a man who had never had to explain himself to people who knew more than he did. He did not expect me to walk through the boardroom door. I came in with Nora Bellamy on my left and my father on my right. Callum Vale followed. The room changed before anyone had said a word. Several of Grant's investors had worked with my father for years. One had been at Callum's most recent fund launch. They knew these names. They knew what those names meant in terms of resources, credibility, and institutional weight. What they had not known, until that moment, was that the quiet woman Grant had described as a domestic complication was the controlling signature behind the credit line that had kept their investment alive for 3 years. Nora spoke first. She laid out the legal structure of the guarantor agreement in clear, plain language, what it covered, what it restricted, what my withdrawal of consent had triggered, and why the bank had acted as it had. She did not editorialize. She did not frame it as a personal dispute. She presented it as a contractual matter with documented consequences. Then Edwin Price joined the meeting by secure video call and confirmed the bank's position directly. No major transfers under the secured facility without my verified authorization, no further discretionary spending from the restricted accounts, and a mandatory internal review of potential misuse of the guarantor-backed structure. Grant sat at the head of the table with the expression of a man watching the floor shift beneath him. He said nothing during Nora's presentation and nothing during Edwin's confirmation. I did not mention Celine Ward's name once. I did not need to. I placed the printed transfer records in the center of the table. The sapphire necklace appeared in the first document. Hotel suites on page 3. Town car billing on page 5. The condo deposit on page 7. Celine's initials appeared 4 separate times. The room read the documents in silence. Celine arrived at the board meeting late. She had not been invited, but she had found out through Grant's assistant where he was and had come looking for an explanation about the failed condo deposit and the calls he had stopped answering. She walked in wearing the sapphire necklace. I think she wore it deliberately, as evidence of something, as proof of a position she believed she held. The investors turned toward her slowly when she entered. Grant's face went the color of old concrete. Celine looked around the room, registered the papers on the table, registered my father, registered Callum, and began to understand that she had walked into something she had not been prepared for. She demanded to know why Grant had stopped answering her calls. She asked about the condo deposit and why it had failed to process. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. The investors watched her the way people watch a situation explain itself without anyone having to narrate it. She was not a future wife entering a professional meeting. She was a line item in a fraud review, standing in a room full of people who had just read the receipts. Grant said nothing. He could not explain her presence without making his own position worse. Grant spoke when the silence became unbearable. He said I was acting emotionally, trying to destroy his company because he wanted a divorce, and that the entire freeze was retaliation dressed in legal language. Nora let him finish. Then she asked whether he had introduced Celine Ward as a personal partner at the Whitestone Museum in front of investors and donors while using guarantor-backed accounts to fund personal benefits in her name. Grant said nothing. My father leaned forward, placed both hands flat on the table, and said quietly, "My daughter's emotions did not freeze your accounts. Your signature on that agreement did." The room stayed completely still after that. Grant had spent 6 years constructing a version of our marriage in which my presence was decorative and my name was incidental. Every person at that table now understood that my name had been operational, the load-bearing structure beneath the investment they had trusted. Grant had known this and acted as though it were not true. The version of events he had relied on to protect himself had just dissolved in front of the people he most needed to believe it. No one at the table spoke on his behalf. Grant attempted to negotiate directly with Edwin Price after the meeting. He called the bank's risk office twice that afternoon and sent a formal request through his own attorney asking for a temporary release of funds pending resolution of what he described as a private family dispute. The bank declined both times. The agreement was not ambiguous. It did not contain a clause for temporary exceptions based on the personal preferences of the account holder. The freeze would remain in place until I provided formal written authorization for each transaction, and I had not provided authorization for anything. Payroll and verified vendor payments were carved out carefully to protect the employees and contractors who had nothing to do with any of it. But Grant's personal spending stopped completely. His private car service account was closed. His corporate luxury cards were suspended. The condo deal Celine had been promised collapsed when the deposit remained frozen past the contract deadline. Celine removed the sapphire necklace before she left the building that afternoon. I was told this by someone who had watched her unclasp it in the lobby and put it in her bag. I do not know what she did with it after that. It no longer had anything to do with me. Grant's original separation draft had offered me a modest financial settlement, the removal of my name from the company, and what his attorney had called a dignified and private resolution. Nora's formal response was 81 pages. It demanded full repayment of all guarantor-backed funds that had been used outside the terms of the original agreement. It required legal separation of Ellis Legacy Trust from all Voss Urban Group liabilities. It required a formal public correction of my role in the company's financial survival during the waterfront development crisis. It required full protection against any concealed debts that might later be traced to accounts connected to my signature. And it required a complete audit trail of every internal document where my signatory authority had been removed or obscured without my consent. Grant's attorney stopped referring to me as Mrs. Voss in the patronizing tone he had used in his first 2 communications. By the end of the second week, he was asking Nora what terms might allow Grant to avoid a broader investor lawsuit. The man who had handed me a draft settlement in a museum corridor with quiet confidence that I would accept it was now negotiating from a position that looked nothing like the one he had imagined he held. Celine came to see me once. Not at the penthouse, but in the lobby of the Ellis Foundation building on a Thursday morning. She looked tired and carefully composed. She asked directly whether Grant had ever actually owned the money he had been promising her. I told her the truth. Grant owned his ambition. He borrowed the rest. She looked at the bare place on her collarbone where the necklace had been. She said Grant had described me as a background figure, someone given a comfortable position without ever truly contributing to what he built. He had told her I was too limited to appreciate the life he was offering. I looked at her and said, "He didn't promise you my life, Celine. He promised you a life he was renting with my signature." She did not respond after that. She looked at the Ellis name on the lobby wall, then walked back through the glass doors into the street. I watched her go, and felt something I had not expected. Not victory, not satisfied, not even relief. Something quieter and more complete than any of those. The word that came to me later, sitting at my desk with the afternoon light across the floor, was simply, done. Callum did not ask me to return to him. That is important, and I want to say it clearly. He helped me understand the business exposure, connected me with the right people, and then stepped back without making any of it about himself. That was the quality I had not fully appreciated when I was younger. He understood the difference between supporting someone and positioning yourself as their reason for succeeding. Months passed. The divorce was finalized. Grant was removed from operational control of Voss Urban Group after a governance review confirmed his financial representations had been materially misleading. The bank restructured the secured debt under new terms that no longer required my guarantee. One evening, Callum invited me to dinner at the Whitestone Museum, which was hosting a new exhibition his foundation had helped fund. I almost said no. I stood in my apartment looking at the invitation for a long time. Then I thought about the woman who had stood in that building with a bank notice in her clutch and an auction paddle in her hand, and I decided I would not let one painful evening define what the building meant to me. I said yes. I sold the penthouse and moved into a brownstone near the waterfront. Tall windows, original floors, and enough space for the life I wanted to build on my own terms. I chose every piece of furniture myself. I chose the paint for every room. No one else's preferences were consulted. After 6 years of accommodating and standing slightly behind, it felt like learning to breathe fully again. The Ellis Foundation continued its work. My father asked me to take a more active role in the trust's grant review process, and I accepted because it was work I found genuinely meaningful. Nora and I had dinner once a month. I returned to several charity boards I had quietly stepped back from during the harder years of the marriage, and the people on those boards welcomed me as though I had never been diminished, which made me realize the diminishment had mostly lived inside the marriage and not outside it. Grant had made me feel small in a room my family had built for decades. He had done it deliberately, in front of people with a smile. What he had never understood was that the room had its own memory, and it had known my name far longer than it had known his. A year after the auction, Voss Urban Group still existed, but Grant no longer ran it. Investors restructured governance, brought in new leadership, and moved the company forward. The bank cleared accounts under new terms. The fraud review concluded with financial penalties and a formal settlement. Celine had moved on. Grant was working on something smaller elsewhere. I did not follow his progress. I had no reason to. Callum and I spent that anniversary evening at the museum quietly, at a table near the window, with no performance and no audience. We talked about the exhibition. We talked about a coastal property project he was working on. We talked about what I wanted my next chapter to look like, and he listened to every word without offering a single correction unless I asked for one. Grant had called me nobody in a room full of 200 people. He had said it with complete confidence, as though the word would stay attached to me. What he had never understood, what he had refused across 6 years to see, was that my name was not decorative. It never had been. It was the signature on the document that held his world in place. And when I withdrew it, his world confirmed exactly how much it had always mattered.